4年了，第5年了，今年。
哦，真的。
My export business just vanished overnight. 90% of my orders came from the US. Now it's zero. My workers are gone, my machines are silent, and I don't know how I'll feed my family next month. Chen Rui, 42-year-old factory, Zhejiang province. In just over a month, China's exports to the US have plunged by a staggering 90%, as new tariffs slam the door shut on a once thriving market. Small businesses are being crushed, supply chains are unraveling, and the Chinese government insists everything is fine. How did things spiral so quickly? Why is the government claiming stability while citizens face economic devastation? And what does this mean for China's future in the global economy? As tensions between the US and China escalated in early April 2025, no one could have predicted the devastating impact the new tariffs would have. The world had already been grappling with years of trade disputes, but the moves made by former President Trump on April 2nd took things to a whole new level. The US introduced a fresh round of tariffs, some as high as 145%, targeting Chinese goods across a wide range of industries, from electronics to textiles. The response from China was swift. On April 4th, China retaliated with tariffs of up to 125% on US products, including agricultural exports like soybeans and pork. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about livelihoods. Businesses, from large corporations to small manufacturers, braced themselves for the worst. China's once thriving export industry, which had grown accustomed to being the global supplier for US companies, now faced crippling uncertainty. But despite this, the Chinese government was quick to downplay the severity of the situation. In official statements, the government continued to insist that the economy was resilient and that they had the situation under control. But this official narrative didn't match what was happening on the ground. In Beijing, Shanghai, and other major cities, the reality was far bleaker. Factories shut down or cut production as demand from the US plummeted. Meanwhile, small businesses that had relied on US exports were left scrambling, unable to make ends meet. While the government continues to project confidence, the real story lies in the personal experiences of those most affected. Zhang, a factory owner in Guangdong, shares his frustration. I've had to cut production by 70%. Orders have dropped off completely. The government says everything is fine, but that's not true for us. We're drowning. Zhang's experience mirrors that of many small business owners across China who are now questioning how much longer they can survive. Lina, who exports textiles to the US, paints a similarly grim picture.
The
tariffs have raised costs so much our American clients can't afford to buy anymore. We've seen a 60% drop in orders in just a few weeks, she says. In an industry already facing fierce competition, these new barriers have made it almost impossible to stay competitive. Lina's story is one of many. Small businesses, often the backbone of China's manufacturing sector, are now bearing the brunt of these tariffs. We've tried to find new markets, but the US was our biggest client. Now, I don't know what to do, she admits. Moving from the cities to rural China, we hear from Wang, a soybean farmer in Heilongjiang province. For years, he's supplied soybeans to US companies, but now, with tariffs pushing prices sky high and demand plummeting, he's losing his main source of income. I have to throw away crops. I can't even cover the cost of planting, Wang says. For a farmer like Wang, the US market was vital, and without it, his family's future is uncertain. The government tells us we're resilient, but I don't know how much longer I can hold on, he says. In Shanghai, Li Wei, a logistics worker at one of China's largest ports, also shares. The shipments just aren't coming in anymore. There are piles of goods waiting to be sent to the US, but no one is buying, Li Wei explains. The impact of the tariffs isn't just on businesses, it's on workers like Li Wei, whose job is directly tied to the flow of goods. I've never been so worried about my future, he says. His fear is palpable, and it's shared by countless others in industries that rely on the US market. Finally, in Beijing, Joe, a small business owner who imports US products like electronics and beauty items, also talks about how sales have plummeted since the tariffs were imposed, and he's been forced to raise prices, pushing his customers away. I don't know how long I can keep my shop open. I'm just trying to survive, Joe says. He's frustrated, not just with the tariffs, but with the government's response. They keep telling us that everything is fine, but it's not. People are struggling, he adds. Zhou's experience is a stark contrast to the official narrative, and is a growing sentiment across the country. But while these personal stories show the devastating impact on the ground, the Chinese government continues to reassure the public. So, what's really going on? As the economic fallout from the tariffs continues to spread, the Chinese government insists that the country is weathering the storm. In press conferences and public statements, officials have repeatedly assured both domestic and international audiences that the Chinese economy remains strong and resilient. On April 10, China's Vice Premier Liu He, who has been central to trade negotiations, publicly declared, "China's economy is stable. We are in control and we will adapt to the changing global environment." These assurances have become a common refrain, but the question remains, if everything is truly stable, why are so many people struggling? The Chinese government has a long history of presenting an optimistic view of the economy, and many fear that officials are trying to avoid public panic. On April 12th, China's State Council announced an economic stimulus package, claiming it would provide relief to affected industries and workers. Yet, the specifics of this relief remain vague. Analysts argue that the measures lack immediate impact, and the ongoing trade war only seems to be deepening the crisis. But as we've seen in the personal accounts from business owners, farmers, and workers, the reality is quite different. While Beijing insists the economy is resilient, the numbers tell a different story. Unemployment rates in certain sectors, especially manufacturing and exports, are at their highest in years. The National Bureau of Statistics reported a 10% rise in joblessness in the affected industries between April 2nd and May 1st. And these numbers don't even account for those who have left the workforce entirely, disillusioned by the lack of opportunities. Even more concerning, the official narrative fails to address the scale of the economic strain being felt by smaller businesses, especially in regions far from Beijing's corridors of power. Local governments continue to promote the resiliency of the economy, but in rural areas like Heilongjiang and Guangdong, the absence of government assistance has left people feeling abandoned. In fact, there are growing signs of frustration among the Chinese public. Protests, though small and heavily controlled, have started to surface in industrial cities. Workers have been openly questioning the government's handling of the crisis, citing broken promises and the failure to provide meaningful financial relief. One anonymous protester in Dongguan, a manufacturing hub, summed it up.
They
keep telling us to hold on, but for how long? The government needs to show us real solutions, not just words. The government's failure to address the pain of ordinary citizens has sparked a wider conversation in Chinese media, which, while state-controlled, has started to show cracks. Some articles in independent online publications have begun to question the government's portrayal of economic stability, offering more critical perspectives that wouldn't have been possible a few years ago. What's clear now is that there's a massive disconnect between what the Chinese government is saying and what people are experiencing. While officials may continue to speak about resilience and economic recovery, the daily struggles of millions of people paint a far more grim picture. For them, the trade war isn't a geopolitical game, it's a fight for survival. So, what does all this mean for China's future? With a 90% drop in exports to the US, the impact is only going to get worse. As China reels from a 90% collapse in exports to its largest trade partner, the economic ripple effects are not just national, they're global. The world is watching as the second largest economy struggles to maintain its position in a rapidly shifting trade landscape. And the implications go far beyond the factory floor. China has long been known as the world's factory, but that status is under unprecedented pressure. With American companies pulling back and tariffs pricing Chinese goods out of competitiveness, supply chains are fragmenting. Multinational firms are actively relocating production to countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico, markets that aren't entangled in trade hostilities with the US. According to data from China's Ministry of Commerce, over 1,200 foreign-owned factories have either downsized or shut down entirely since April 2nd. Companies that once relied on China for everything from microchips to apparel are now urgently seeking alternatives. And for Chinese suppliers, these departures aren't just business losses, they're existential threats. The financial sector is also taking a hit. Foreign investment, already cautious due to China's tightening political climate, is now retreating even faster. The Shanghai Composite Index has fallen nearly 18% since April 2nd, and the yuan is facing increased volatility. International firms are reassessing the risk of doing business in China, especially amid growing doubts about the government's transparency. In the short term, China is losing contracts, jobs, and credibility, but in the long term, it's losing the trust that built its export empire. Once considered the most reliable hub for global production, China now faces a future in which it may no longer be the centerpiece of the world's supply chain. Domestically, the pain is also spreading to the average consumer. With factories closing and jobs disappearing, purchasing power is shrinking. Retail sales in April fell 11% year-over-year, with consumer confidence at its lowest level since 2020. As inflation ticks up and income stagnates, ordinary citizens are scaling back on everything from electronics to food. One resident in Chengdu, who asked not to be named, says,
是比较 asexual， 就是
Even basic groceries are more expensive now. My husband lost his job at the export warehouse last week. We're cutting costs wherever we can. Her story is becoming more common by the day. Beijing has long promoted the idea that China can pivot away from dependence on the US and strengthen ties with countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. But so far, that pivot is falling short. New trade deals take time to negotiate and even longer to bear fruit. And China's domestic demand isn't strong enough to make up for the collapse in US orders. Even China's flagship Belt and Road Initiative projects are facing scrutiny and delays as partner nations express concern over China's economic health and its ability to fulfill investment commitments. It's becoming clear that decoupling from the US won't be as easy or as painless as officials once claimed. China's economic troubles are not happening in a vacuum. The slowdown is already sending shockwaves through global markets. Countries that export raw materials to China, like Brazil and Australia, are seeing falling demand. Ports from Los Angeles to Rotterdam are handling fewer Chinese containers. And global companies, from Apple to General Motors, are being forced to rethink sourcing strategies that have depended on China for decades. If the current trajectory continues, China may face not just a short-term trade crisis, but a long-term downgrade in its global economic standing. But perhaps the most urgent question now is, how much worse can this get? If the past month is any indication, the worst may still be ahead. As of May 8th, there are no signs of de-escalation between Washington and Beijing. In fact, signals from both sides suggest the standoff is hardening, and fast. According to leaked documents from the U.S. Trade Representative's office, new levies could soon target Chinese automotive parts, lithium batteries, and even solar panels, key sectors for China's future growth. Meanwhile, in Beijing, officials are preparing countermeasures of their own. On May 6th, China's Ministry of Commerce announced plans to review all U.S.-related trade channels for national security risk. Analysts believe this is a precursor to more sweeping restrictions, possibly even targeting rare earth exports, minerals critical to U.S. tech and defense industries. Behind the scenes, there's growing desperation. Sources close to state-owned enterprises report that Beijing is quietly pressuring major firms to maintain production levels, even without buyers, simply to avoid mass layoffs. But that's not sustainable. Warehouses are filling up, inventories are overflowing, and logistics networks are stalling under the weight of unsold goods. One logistics executive in Shenzhen, speaking anonymously, says,
身材好一点就可以了。
什么样的才叫身材好？
It's like we're pretending the orders are still coming. The trucks are still running, but there's nowhere to send the cargo. It's all a show. This economic pressure is beginning to spill over into China's tightly controlled social space. Social media posts, many quickly censored, have surfaced showing protest footage, factory gate sit-ins, and appeals from workers begging for unpaid wages. The Chinese Communist Party's worst fear is beginning to surface, that economic hardship could translate into civil unrest. The government has started increasing domestic propaganda efforts, flooding state TV and online platforms with messages of economic strength and self-reliance. But behind the facade, cracks are widening. In a May 5th survey by an independent Hong Kong-based research group, 61% of urban respondents said they believe the economic situation is worse than the government admits. The United States, meanwhile, is not backing down. American voters, still wary of China's global ambitions, overwhelmingly support hardline trade policies. In Congress, bipartisan support for expanded tariffs remains strong, with key lawmakers proposing legislation that would block Chinese firms from accessing U.S. federal contracts and financial services. This isn't just about tariffs anymore, it's about decoupling. American companies are accelerating their China exit strategies, and many are unlikely to return, even if the trade war ends. That's a reality Beijing is beginning to confront, and it carries deep, long-term consequences. Global supply chains are now caught in a state of panic. Freight rates are rising, delivery times are stretching, and raw materials are being rerouted at massive cost.
Now
We've had to move production to Indonesia in 3 weeks, something that would normally take 6 months. It's chaos. Everyone's scrambling, says one US-based procurement officer. And it's not just companies. Countries that depend on Chinese exports are facing their own economic headaches, rising prices, product shortages, and sudden gaps in critical infrastructure materials. If tariffs continue to rise, or if China retaliates with rare earth restrictions or tighter export controls, the global economy could face a cascading series of disruptions. China in particular may be forced into more aggressive internal measures, currency devaluation, mass bailouts, or stricter capital controls. At this rate, a full decoupling between the US and China is no longer just a possibility. It's looking more like a certainty. And for the millions of workers, businesses, and families caught in the middle, the consequences are already here and growing by the day.